Gettysburg anyway. They hardly knew much about it, where it was. This is probably the worst map we show you because of lack of details. You can see from any distance. We'll get a point here. And you all recognize at least the silhouette of the area here, New York. And this is the outline of the highway that I took down here just recently. This road goes up here. And get on the Taconic State Parkway, and you get down to Gettysburg, or very near Gettysburg, without getting a traffic light, comes down to 650 down here. So it's a very fast trip. When I got down there, I thought I'd take a mileage, but I got kind of excited reaching here, so I drive around and about to couple miles again. It took me a good 6 to 7 hours, depending on how long you stop. And I give you any details or anybody like this, and afterwards, bring a sandwich or something to eat along here, because hopefully the Pennsylvanians here was pretty kind of well tricked again, and slag heaps, low hills and so forth, trucks below, but it's a fast run. You get down here, and this is complicated around here. It looks complicated on the map. Pretty soon you begin to see Gettysburg, Admiral Field, and you take it right down there. And you're right down there in Gettysburg before you know it. Now I have another map too that will show you a little bit about the topography of the land, which doesn't show on these maps too well. But the placement of Gettysburg here, and here's Harrisburg, and here's Baltimore, Washington, and Richmond, the capital. Now, the thing of it is, that Gettysburg is over the border in Pennsylvania. The least troops reached within 7 miles of Harrisburg. They were in York, Pennsylvania. We always have it here. They were in Carlisle, and the first barracks in Carlisle. It's a famous incident out there in Jamestown. And occupied the Chambersburg. So that, and I'll tell you why. If you can see, they figure these armies up in here. What is going on in Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia? Because Lee was gotten up into the Northern Territory. It was the second invasion of the North. And Washington and Baltimore were pretty much in a panic. And even Philadelphia, they began to build barricades. Harrisburg was expected to be attacked. And one of the corps of Lee's army actually thought that he could take Harrisburg. So this I put on here for a length of time, just so you get an idea of what is transpiring. Stuart's cavalry, which played kind of a role in a negative way, went up in this direction and began cutting telegraph lines. Telegraph lines are the only means of communication, of course, in those days. No radio, horseback and so forth. The Stuarts, the Confederate cavalry began to cut telegraph lines all through here. Just so Washington and Baltimore were cut off as to what was going on over and through here. And here you see Hagerstown. I thought I had this from Columbus to Martinsburg. And here we have the Winchester, Virginia, where perhaps the first interest in the Civil War started, because this is very rich in history of the Civil War. You keep reading about it, he's dispatched, he's back and forth, up and down the valley, and so forth. But he's on the other side of the mountain. I'll show you that in another picture. This, I hope, will move along fast as soon as we kind of set the stage. Because I'll talk as we go along here, because I've got a number of slides. First Bull Run, see the date, July 1861. Lee won, historians believe, 4 out of his 5 major battles with the Federals. First Bull Run was one of them, July 1861. Shiloh, this was interesting, this was kind of a standoff. This is in Tennessee, 6th, 7th April, 1862. And here you'll see a general on a horse there in the center, and that turns out to be General Grant, who ultimately will defeat the Confederacy. And he on a side battle here, he captured Fort Donelson, and he became nicknamed, as you see there if you read that, Unconditional Surrender Grant, who refused to bargain. And he was an outstanding general for that point. He, at one time, believe it or not, after the Battle of Vicksburg, which he captured, they thought they should get rid of him because he sent so many troops to their absolute death. He was absolutely ruthless that way as a general, but at least he succeeded, and Lincoln kept him on. As you go through these stories, you see that Lincoln was really quite good at appraising the situation as the head of even his commander-in-chief back in Washington. Gaines Mills, this is where the Confederacy found its hero of Lee himself. This is hard to believe, but an army of the Federals is down there, and I'll show you in a map, of 120,000, and they began to become fragmented and routed, and Lee set out after to destroy them. He never destroyed them, and then again later on after Gettysburg, it was the Federals' turn to try to destroy him, which actually didn't happen either. But Gaines Mills is important as a big victory. It ended the Peninsula Campaign. Antietam was the first attempt to invade the North in 17 September 1862. And Antietam was a very bloody battle indeed. And it ended, some people think, in a draw, but certainly nobody was defeated. But Lee could not, this is also known as Sharpsburg, by the way. You'll hear this as Sharpsburg. But Lee did not get any further than Sharpsburg, Maryland. Maryland was important because it was a border state, and we thought it might come back on the side of Confederacy. But back here, we're now in 1863, getting close to Gettysburg time, Chancellorsville, and the Battle of the Wilderness. I've been there and gone through that area and the wilderness, and it looks like that today, except because there's leaves on the trees. And it was just a complete rout of the Federals who were done in at every turn by the maneuverings of Lee and Jackson and Longstreet. Then we come to Gettysburg, 1 to 3 of July, and this is the time in which Lee has decided to invade the North and did not want to pick Gettysburg, but this is where the battles were, that momentous battle was founded. Now, this is another map just to get a little bit of the picture here. By this time, the commanding general was replaced by Hooker. And Lee got his troops together and headed up north. Now, reorganized and headed up on the other side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this is Washington, and this Harrisburg up here. And this, of course, represents Hooker with the Federals heading up, trying to find out what Lee's intentions were and keep the rest of the situation and protect Washington. Through this talk, we could talk for a number of days until the battle will take place. But Brandy Station, a very important thing took place. Lee was at his scene. The Federal Army had recouped, but he had really reorganized very well, and Brandy Station became a significant, that was a significant turning point. In fact, the run lost from Lee to south. But in that Brandy Station, General Pleasanton with 10,000 cavalry engaged as Stuart. And Stuart was, uses kind of a phrase, flamboyant character, and you see with the cast of his hat and so forth. And he staged a local gentry kind of mock battle around Brandy Station, and his generals heard about his cavalry attached to, and started down and attacked attacked Stuart, unbeknownst to him, just rode in on him. And he finally turned the tide. But it gained for the Federals, the infantry and so on, a new respect for the cavalry, because although they were ultimately defeated, for the first time, Union cavalry stood up to the Confederates. And it happened at the Grand Station, one ominous portent for Lee. And he knew what had happened. And then from then on, Stuart was trying to recoup his reputation. This represents Lee's army cleared the Federals from Winchester. Well, that's in the text. But this is a Brandy Station portrayal of the battle in which Stuart was. Now we got the. You don't want that. Let's back up a bit here. So this is one of the portents of trouble for Lee as he started up north. I thought at this point, we have the lights just for a second. I thought to bore you with a little bit of statistics, but to know what shape the Federals were in and what Lee was up against. The Union generals in charge of the invasion of Virginia were several, and they were all deposed because they were so inefficient. And that was Polk, Banks, McDowell, Hooker, and after a while after Gettysburg, he was replaced by Grant. These intentions, I'll touch on that, were of course to get recognition. He had 75,000 men going up the valley, the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania, 287 guns, and this portent of trouble ahead was Brandy Station, the ultimate victory, of course, of the Confederates, but with due respect to the cavalry, and loss of Jackson, which I'll touch on too. And then Stuart took off, and he was gone for a week. But anyway, Lee had to get a victory in the north because he was the Confederacy being watched, and they were hoping to get recognized by France and Britain. And indeed, Lee himself, I don't have it written here, but Lee himself had observers with him, a British observer, and of course you guessed it, he had a Prussian military observer. I can tell you a little bit of a side of that, how the German General Staff actually was in Winchester, Virginia before World War II. But he started to converge on Gettysburg. The Confederates had an army of 75,000 and wound up with the Union having an army of 85,000. So pretty soon at Gettysburg, we're going to get 160,000, 170,000 people, combatants, in a 25 square mile area of roughly 6 by 3 to 4 miles wide. We're going to see a battle with 53,000 casualties in 3 days, with 5 generals killed in the Confederacy and 3 generals killed in the Union, with a loss of 27% by the Union and 30% by the Confederacy. Before Lee was ultimately to get back over to Detroit with the Union and rather slow pursuit. So with those statistics here, which you don't have to remember, but I think it gives an idea of the panorama of what was to take place. I'd like to thank you. So they're on their way. Lee has sent troops up to Carlisle. They're out to Harrisburg. Some of his troops are in York. Stuart is the other side, on the eastern side there, on the where it says Maryland, of the Union Army, and he is doing everything that is getting them into trouble. And Stuart was considered, as Lee called them, the eyes of his army. Well, what about now? I thought to show you some pictures of these cast of characters that are going to take place in Gettysburg. And of course, now we're going back again. George Gordon Meade was appointed, believe it or not, only 3 days to replace Hooker, and he was appointed just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. A man of enormous talent and organization, and he grasped the situation very well and disposed his troops extremely well. He was a Pennsylvania, age 46, and a graduate of West Point. Here's another shot. Let's take another look at him here. He was a taciturn kind of a fellow. He did not get along with the press at all, and they called him some kind of a turtle, and you can see he does have somewhat of a turtle-like expression, but he was given to outbursts and did not get along with the press at all. But he had proved himself efficient in handling the Corps and down on the Peninsula campaign. So he replaced Hooker. They were looking for an excuse to get Hooker out. And interesting enough, when Lee was at Chambersburg and he heard that Hooker had been replaced by Meade, and he had known Meade, he said, you can be sure, there's another portent, you can be sure that George Meade will not make any mistakes. Lee himself, of course, was a West Point graduate from the Lee family in Virginia. And he, believe it or not, I didn't know this until recently, he was the superintendent of West Point for a number of years. And many of the combatants, of course, on both sides, and he had actually trained, was supervised the training of them at West Point. At the Gaines Mill Peninsula campaign, he became of course, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. And the Army of the Potomac was the Union Army. He always appeared bigger than life, you might say, extremely admired, respected by his men, even in defeat. And he ultimately took all the responsibility for Gettysburg on his shoulders. Here is Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren. He was the chief officer of the Union Army, and he played an extremely vital role, as you'll see here, on the second day of battle, and securing a promontory of land and keeping it out of Confederate hands. They could have won the battle if he was not there. So I know all of you have read about Gettysburg, may have your own heroes, but this was one of them, and there was so many that I don't want to tread on anybody's toes that have other favorites, but this man really did quite a job, practically single-handed. Sickles, here he was the one, each general here, by the way, had a corps commander, and this was Sickles, he was a corps commander, who could have been court-martialed for what they did or did not do. And one of them was Sickles, and we'll see what he did before. He was a political appointee, by the way, and he led his men out into open fields, and it almost became a disaster. And there's some of the other corps commanders there, and they're a tough-looking bunch. As you can see, they really look mean. They're all really heroes. Meade had 7 corps commanders like they used to deal with, whereas Lee had only 3. So there was some difficulty in command, but despite that, Meade did very well. This is General Longstreet. General Longstreet was a corps commander with Lee and did extremely well all through the year, but he disagreed with Lee considerably and really held back. He was called my good right arm by, no, that's one of the other generals, but he was called a very dependable general. He had a favorite name for him. But Longstreet at Gettysburg, he probably thought he should be in charge of the whole army. And he held back quite a bit and did not carry out his orders. He should have been relieved in command. Everything I've read at 1 or 2 points in the Battle of Gettysburg. So Lee had his trouble too. Richard Ewell was put in charge of Jackson's old corps. And Ewell showed some promise in earlier battles in the Shenandoah Valley as a successor to Jackson. Well, he also lost heart and lost courage and did not carry out orders on time. He was waiting for other troops to catch up to him, he said, so forth. But he also caused Lee quite a bit of trouble. He had a lot of trouble with these subordinates. Now, here's Stuart himself, and you've seen him, pictures of him all with that cap on. Stuart disappeared for a week, did not show up till the second day of battle. He went out to establish everybody reasonable to regain some of his glory, and he got himself in all kinds of trouble by picking up a wagon train, slowing himself down, and Lee did not know where he was. Finally, he wound up in York, Pennsylvania. And when he finally got back to Lee, his troops were pretty tired. So Lee had to pick on another cavalry general, Pickett. You've heard Pickett's charge here. General Pickett, believe it or not, was appointed to West Point by Abraham Lincoln as he came from Illinois. This battle is filled with these little sidelights. Here's a general that did not fight here, but you just had to put him in. Stonewall Jackson here. He was Lee's good right arm, and when Lee lost Stonewall Jackson at the Wilderness Wilderness battle, he lost his really audacious general who could really carry out orders and saw opportunities and work with Lee hand in glove. It was a bad thing for Lee, and he realized it right along and lamented the fact that he no longer had Stonewall Jackson, and Ewell did not measure up to Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was shot by his own men by mistake, if you remember. So here we are, we're getting into Gettysburg itself. Now, why did Gettysburg become so important? That neither wanted to fight here. But this is a very good map, and you can see it. It shows the string of mountains. Blue Ridge Mountains here, Appalachian Mountains over here, and Blue Ridge Mountains becomes from the Allegheny Mountains. And Shenandoah Valley becomes the Cumberland Valley. And you see how about Gettysburg here? Road coming from Carlisle, road coming from York, road coming from Chambersburg, and these are all this is about 25 miles, 25 territory of these roads. And all these roads here from Baltimore, which is different roads from Baltimore, and other highways. I think you add up to this, how they checked before, you can add up to 8 or 9 highways. Ideal highway to bring the troops. Lee was hoping that he, who was out here, did not copy what it was, and he missed the Stuart in the world, hoping to draw east down into the Crashtown Pass. This is past the mountains here. They're not really very high. Chambersburg. See, there's no passes here. This is why Lee was always able to walk down this valley. If you have to get through the mountain, you have to go around something like that. So the Crashtown Pass became very important for the gain access to this lush countryside. Lee lived on the countryside over here, whereas Lee had trains and so forth coming in from Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington. On the other hand, Meade, and I don't really know why it's not pretty good. He was trying to entice Meade to fight him around here. He thought it would be a good defensive position to protect Baltimore, and it sounded pretty good. But he started thinking around here. And then to set up Buford's cavalry up to Gettysburg to find out what was going on. So let's see what happened. Hope you see all those figures. I want to show just a few slides of what these are pictures from magazines of what it looked like. There's a Chambersburg pike. That's the way that these troops, a lot of them came down towards Gettysburg. This is outside Gettysburg. The Chambersburg pike. If you get down there, you see how important that is. This is Gettysburg. Looks a lot like that today. I was on a hill looking at the Gettysburg. Looked almost identical to that. And I still think that's the Chambersburg pike. It could be any one of the others, but it's in that typical rolling countryside. Lee and Meade realized that this rolling countryside was ideal for battle because there were ridges to hide behind, woods to hide in, and open fields to charge across and so forth. It was a real big playground for all these troops. Morning of July 1st, 1863, General Buford. You don't have to remember all these names, of course, unless you'd like to. But that's looking out the Chambersburg pike today, the picture that I took. It seems though some elements from Hill's army started in towards Gettysburg to look for some shoes, and this is a fact, you wouldn't believe it. But they thought there was a warehouse full of shoes, when actually it turned out that there was just an ad in a newspaper for shoes. Interestingly enough, and I hope it won't detain you too long, but there's so much you can, as you read the history on this, the troop information came from newspapers for Lee, believe it or not. The reporters were reporting everything. And I think Grant, for one general, tried to actually court-martial a reporter for reporting information. But he'd send out scouts, these men would send out scouts to get newspapers. And they find out where everybody was. So they decided they reread this newspaper that there was shoes in town. They started in a small unit. They chased away and actually captured a small group of it was kind of a local militia, and they were actually made up of students at Gettysburg College. And they soon fled when they saw what was happening. And a couple of days before July 1st, they thought that was all that was there. But of course, Buford was on his way in, the cavalry unit. And pretty soon, these are pictures that I've taken down there. We have Buford realizing that these troops were coming into town from Chambersburg, some of the elements of these groups. They had no idea how many or what it was, but they lay in wait on a ridge right outside of town, waiting for this advanced group. Now, here's an interesting thing. One other thing, this is another thing that affected the course of battle. Here, and this is a soldier with a carbine. Now, Lee thought they were just militia, but this is a carbine, and I have one here. I want to turn on the lights for a second. And I think that judging by the picture, it's the same type of carbine here. And this opens up, and it's breech-loading carbine. And what's the cavalry unit, when you see this on the cavalry unit, had these. They had enormous firepower because they could load instantly by just putting it in a crash shell, as opposed to the muzzle loader. Another thing that was to have effect throughout the battle, you didn't have to load this standing up. This is not a percussion gun, but it looks like this is a trapdoor, or a breech-loading trapdoor. But for all the world, to Springfield, it looks just like the muskets that were used on those times. And they had to be loaded as muzzle loaded. That Minnesota had to stand up, but the product had to get down there. So when the cavalry unit dismounted, of course, had these carbines, and they it was devastating to face the muskets. This is exactly what that first unit had. Okay, nice. And that looks like the same time. This is the Burnside carbine. There are a couple others that were used too, Sharps and so forth. Spencer is another name. And of course, as the skirmishes went on, artillery was brought in. These artillery pieces along that ridge and facing towards the Chambersburg Pike. Cavalry units had artillery with them, so they brought up a few pieces of artillery. And these, I've taken a little liberty. This is from another portion of the battlefield. These are all from monuments here. And immediately, the Confederates, this is a Confederate statue, you can recognize that as well dressed in the Union. And they really are in terrible shape that way. Suddenly knew they were up against something. And then a shot was fired from a cannon from the Confederates. And believe it or not, they have there the opening gun of the Battle of Gettysburg, very interesting, July 1st, 1863. Let's see, July 1st, that would be a Wednesday, July 1st. And they located this gun because the battery commander happened to write down the serial number. They found it afterwards and put it back out there. It's in the same spot. There you see the carbines in use. This is supposedly a battle team, but they didn't have to stand up mostly. But they were extremely effective because they could reload and fire so quickly, whereas the other men with muskets, the single shot, had to stand or dismount. And, the Confederate cavalry had sabers. They did not have carbines unless they could capture them. So here we see a typical position of with a long rifle with the percussion type thing. And I just portray him as a sharpshooter. He kind of looks like the position a sharpshooter would take. They played an immense role in this battle here because they were able to pick off certain people. There is, you see these statues all around in the woods and everything else. It's just fascinating to go around and take pictures of them. This was taken right nearby of the Union group waiting what was going on with the Confederates. And General Reynolds, the only corps commander to fall, was killed by one of those sharpshooters and killed instantly. A brilliant Union officer. His loss was comparable to Jackson, believe it or not, to the Union. And there's some woods near these ridges where you can see these statues and walk around and see. The Confederates gained the heights here, and some of you could recognize my weapons carrier in the background next to that gun. They gained some heights here. This is pointed down north of town, looking into town. There is something the Confederates had. They're called Whitfields. They were British breech-loading cannon. They had only two of them, but they were devastating. They could shoot 5 miles, breech-loading cannon, and you can imagine how fast they could be fired as opposed to the other one. But they only have two of them, and they're up there on that ridge north of town. First aid battle. The battle raged on. After Reynolds was shot, General Doubleday, like with baseball fame, who mentioned that book you have on your relative as his commander, Doubleday, took over from Reynolds. So this cavalry battle sabers were used by the Confederacy. Iron Brigade, you see these monuments around. You get a kick out of their names. Stalwarts, Wisconsin, Indiana, and so forth. And they're in this woods here on the ridge outside on the first day here. the human interest stories, or whatever you want to call it, right along here. There are these snatches in the woods. You could just imagine, I don't know who this fellow was, he's loading his gun, but interesting enough, the Confederate general was captured in these woods. As every book I read about it calls him an Irish cavalryman. After a tussle, apparently they wrestled with one another, and this Irish cavalryman put the collar on this Confederate general, brought him up to General Buford, and it turned out that they were classmates in West Point together. And General Buford said how pleased he was to meet him, and the Confederate general says, I'm damn glad not to have met you, or something like that. But it was a choice phrase anyway, as you can imagine, for the embarrassment of being collared the way he was. If you want to call it the semi-humorous incident, the feud that you might want to call it. Cannon were brought up to bear on all these positions, and you see more cannon around here on these heights, and you can trace back the ebb and flow off this hill down into town, the back end of the town. And these batteries are again positions they were before had a more telling effect, and you could just see where they're going. This is the type of terrain they fought through. Hid behind fences and rose up when they saw other groups sneaking around, and just these little low fences offered great protection to them. And there's many of the skirmishes in which troops would be hidden in the woods around stone walls like this. And so we just take the pictures of these Confederates leading their mass charges, and the back and forth north of town on what was called the Seminary Ridge. You see these monuments around everywhere. Recognize we've taken shots from different angles, but there's really quite a lot to be seen in them. People go up and study how they were dressed, how different units were dressed, and duplicate this in uniforms. This is the morning of July 1st, and you see fortuitously, Lee had, when he saw what was going on, or the night before was going on, I thought he might run into trouble, he began to call back Ewell, back from near Harrisburg. This is Ewell's fort here, near Harrisburg. Ewell didn't like this at all, because he thought he could be back at Harrisburg. And he was being sold from then on. And he split up his parties in York. They came in very fortuitously, having been called the night before, or the day before, by the and you can see what's going on here. They're coming in on all sides on the Federals. The Federals here are coming up through the different parts, coming out of the countryside here. This is the old war there, down east one. And even this tight defense line coming up into these on these different highways and pipes and whatnot. And all these roads led to Gettysburg. They said this is not what they wanted. The battle was really on after the first artillery duel. Just to orient you a little bit about Gettysburg here. You see all the pipes coming in. You just digest this a little bit. All these pipes come from north and south. And this Chambersburg pipe coming in here. Here's Seminary Ridge, the Lutheran Seminary, which uses its power into this observation point on both sides. And this is Seminary Ridge. Two mainly, the Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge. These are the two. This is not a very good map. But you begin to see hills that rotate toward the park in subsequent times. So we have the first day in with troops coming down the Federals being swept down through Gettysburg in this direction here, and me coming in down the Seminary Ridge here. Not very big ridges, believe it or not. How they thought they were Well, they started with there's some hills here, showing a very rough part that forms up here. And groups of 40 in here from all over. But the route through Gettysburg by the Federals was tremendous. The head of general, they called it the Bad Luck Brigade, was hiding in the cellar under a pile of wood for 3 days. And one article that I read said he was wounded, but he wasn't too badly wounded. But he hid out there. They were swept right through town. And this is a map that was taken, it's an old map, but it shows you roughly the topography of the land, which turned out to be so important. You'll see this, these buildings still standing up there. This is a Cemetery Hill. The Confederates started to launch attacks up here. And we don't know whether they were really as lined up like that. They were at certain times. But they stormed these heights, and they weren't as high as that. They're fairly steep, but they're coming down through town. The town is up there in the upper corner, and storming these heights where the Federals started to retreat to and gather their forces. And you notice another portent for the Union is gathering into a smaller and smaller area, and Lee is springing himself out along Seminary Ridge, opposite Cemetery Ridge. This is a school book picture of a charge, and nobody really believes that anything like that took place. But you see this in all the pictures. Because I'll show you how later on how they had to give up these tactics very quickly. There it is. The building is still standing, restored. The trees around it. This is after the battle. They cleaned up the guns and so forth. How they threw up breastworks and everything to repel these charges by the Confederates up through there. And the Federals gathered in this cemetery. Don't forget they had access routes to the cemetery from the other side of town. This is Lee's headquarters on the Chambersburg Turnpike. You can visit it today. I visited there. It's a nice little stone house, and there's a museum in it and so forth. That became Lee's headquarters for the Battle of Gettysburg. This house here, this is seen after the battle was cleaned up to a certain degree. So it looks like it's a dead horse or two up there. It became Meade's headquarters. Meade kind of stayed behind for a day or two, but he finally made his headquarters up on the eastern side of Cemetery Ridge. We see pictures of that as we go along. That's how it looked in those days. There's his house restored there, his headquarters. Nice house there, just beautiful. Nice proportions and everything back there. That's what he happened to pick out. It was damaged heavily, of course. So, just a couple of signs take at different times of days, and of course they're all considering one another, eyeing one another as to what to do for the next day. And you see these statues, and they have all kinds of names on them, different brigades and generals and whatnot. And it'd be fascinating to get into the story behind it there. So that the first day ended with a complete rout of the Federals. They retreated back up onto the hills on the other side of town, and over 5,000 Federals were captured in one sweep through town by the Confederates, placing a burden, of course, on the Confederates too. But Meade soon knew he had a battle on his hand and sent out calls to Washington and so forth, and corps were an army corps was on its way. Force marches were made from all directions. Now, if we get this on right, start turning in the right direction. Here's the situation then. Lee gets together with his corps commanders, and they decided what they ought to do. And they decided that they should attack. Here is this, what they call a fish rope. decided to come in from here to Newell, this side, and Long Street to one of Long Street is down to the Newell side. Dig in up there, dig up, and also get coming up here all the time. All the way, any time when we first come over on the road. And here we have very friends with the neighbors. Watch this sign here. And what about little round top, Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, Beach Orchard, and wheat field. So Lee decides to attack on several fronts, as you can see. Look at this line of communication goes for 7 to 9 miles, whereas all that Meade has to do is run up and down on that ridge with couriers to ship people around. This is the open fields in which many of these skirmishes and pitched battles occurred. And this is how it looks today. And you can drive around through there, and the monuments marked out for all these places were typical countryside, in which they fought and swept back and forth across here. This is the kind of the back side of that wheat field they mentioned here. The cyclorama you should see down there. Tremendous paintings that sound effects and so forth, extremely well done. Of the Battle of Gettysburg, it's really possible you have to see that. But these are slides that you could buy, all for reconstruction, very detailed and so forth, where everybody was, and they can tell you what units these both represent. But I thought to show that these statuary around are the typical Confederate soldier advancing. This is actually where you can see the same, the most magnificent monument, I think, on the battlefield. A very stirring type of portrayal of North Carolina. And they engage in the pitched battles throughout. There's quite a bit of delay on the part of Buell on the other side. The starting bombardments, Longstreet is delayed, but they finally get underway quite late in the day. Meanwhile, of course, Meade is shifting his cannon, his troops back and forth, and there's considerable carnage going on. Yeah. But these seem to get a sense of that whole battle scene. This was a priest erecting a statue, sending off some of the brigades. Yeah. Now we come into kind of an interesting thing. We could spend a day talking about that mountain and another one, but take a look at those two little hills there. One is called Little Round Top and the other is Big Round Top. And this is from the Confederate side. And who was the one that came out? No, before that, I'm going to say that there was a pitched battle going on. Sykes, you saw that arrow there. Sykes moved himself out into the open, and they started taking new positions, and the Longstreet's brigades took advantage of it and went after it. Sykes' Corps had a tremendous battle. More to another side of this here. This is looking up on the round tops. The most fascinating possible. These are portrayals. You can see the ebb and tide of battle around those wheat field, peach orchards, and so forth. And the Confederates have an eye on the little round top, and they think it's occupied. But it turns out that it wasn't. And by a fluke of things, when a brigade which was up there was called off to go to the aid on the other side of the battlefield. Actually, the brigade, I think, got displaced. I think I was the one that got displaced for quite a number of hours. And the hill was unoccupied. Now, you're looking up towards a bunch of monuments. I guess you can just barely see them. You're looking north towards town. And as you can see the advantage of this terrain here, if somebody had it. And notice those huge granite boulders through here. This is how it looked afterwards. Big round top and little round top, which was nearer to the ridge. This is not General Warren, but General Warren was up on Little Round Top, and he saw that it was unoccupied because the other troops had vacated it to go to aid over Culp's Hill, and he had come up. He was an engineer and was observing the things along with a signal station of some kind, and saw this unoccupied, was horrified, and suspected what Longstreet was thinking of, or two of his commanders, about Little Round Top. And this is the picture of some opposite point in a direction which Warren might well have done on that day, because he began to suspect that the Confederates are down in those woods opposite Little Round Top. And indeed, what he did was get a hold of a battery or a cannon nearby, went to it, and had him fire a shot into the woods down below Little Round Top and to the left. And as the shell whistled through the woods, it was loaded with the Confederates. They all turned their bayonets and didn't know what was going on. And Warren suddenly realized that the Confederates were in force, ready to sweep up the hill. And he went back on the other side of the hill, or sent somebody back, and managed to get some replacement group that was coming up the Baltimore Pike, and bring them up on the hill with some cannon and build up some of these works and to defend it. And this they did, and this became some of the bitter fighting of the battle. This is a portrayal of the Confederates going up through what they call Devil's Den and Little Round Top. And now you see they're not out in the open, but they're taking advantage of cover. And they're advancing up there. But if Warren had not spotted the weakness in the battle line, you can see from that hill, if cannon were up there, the troops, they could fire down that whole length of the cemetery ridge, especially if they brought up those long range cannon. So there's a pitched battle goes on. These statues are all over. You can see this is the same statue. Up and down the mountain. It's a very small mountain. Hardly you could think of it as a mountain. It's just a hill. This where a sharpshooter was found, and after the battle was labeled as a sharpshooter. A sharpshooter with a, I don't know if you picked it out, but there was one shot there of a sharpshooter with a telescopic sight on his gun. And he began to pick off these officers. He showed you a picture of an officer standing out on top of a little round top. That's what they did, apparently. Sharpshooters are back here in what they call the Devil's Den, a name that hadn't been there before. These enormous boulders, which gave good cover. This is the top of another view, looking up towards the cemetery, the ridge, all along the ridge where that building was. I pointed out before that it was attacked on the day before. There it is. That's the sharpshooter one. Telescopic sights. This is what happened on Little Round Top. It did pick off a lot of the officers high rank up there. But there it is from below. You can imagine trying to charge up there with the troops in force. It was very, very difficult. But as the day ended, the federal troops held a little roundabout and drove back many viciously attacked by different regiments of Longstreet's Corps up and down there. And the big round top in the distance it's just too far away to be of importance, even though it was a taller mountain and it was full of woods anyway. And nobody seemed to get to a big round top. But anyway, Little Round Top was fairly secure, and the line was saved. So you can imagine the second day's battle settling down. You see these statues around it. In other words, wondering what was going to happen on the third day. I think you all know what happened on the third day. The core of their, which was down in the peach orchard, was riddled. The Union losses were frightful on that day, and Meade had a council of war up in that little building he had there, and everybody had to write out what they thought they should do, whether to retreat or to hold firm. And they decided to hold firm, and which they did, and established themselves for the night. But you see, they've secured their flanks all around here. And these two little mountains sites that bore out here went out to the open through the paddling. And we find gathered along the ridge here, Culpsville, and this is discriminated down into here, and Baltimore up here. Bugle was up here, balls up in the back. But the big thing of the day was this planning. You can see the switching the 2 minutes here, the things that break through here, through the center of the line, and of course, the able to destroy the Union Army and gain recognition. So what did he do? Was to gather all his artillery together. Keep advancing. And this is the cannon that he brought up along the, of course there was no road there then, but he brought up along this little ridge, this kind of a make-believe ridge, hidden in the trees. Enormous number of cannon. Don't forget they were pretty well matched as far as firepower and cannon. The only thing was that Lee had cannon of different makes and sizes, and the logistics of supplying the right ammunition for the right cannon was frightful, and many times that it was not possible. But anyway, he brought up all the cannon in through the woods here, and this is what you've heard about it. I guess it's been some 10 years since I've been there, and they brought in a lot of cannon from somewhere. If you simulate war, what it must have been like, I think it almost seems like that. But anyway, Lee wound up with 125 cannon, scattered all through the woods, pointed for the center of that line, center of that ridge on the other side. You see these cannon lining up just the way they were. And this is from the Confederate side. The clump of trees up there is where the destination is. It's 7/8 of a mile. Here's the Union side. Now there's a little white monument down there. It's a pretty big one. I took a lot of the pictures. And where Lee is supposed to have stayed. Probably. So Lee is down on that little ridge the cemetery ridge where this gun is a little bit higher. But anyway, Lee opens up with all his guns, and he claimed 125 guns opened up on 1 p.m. on the third day of battle. And with his firepower aimed at this ridge up here. Union is all lined up here, you can see. And a duel starts in. There's supposed to be 80 cannon on the Federal side, 125 on the Confederate side, and they keep this up for 2 solid hours. Due to a freak in nature, they said they could hear this cannonade in Pittsburgh, 150 miles away. And yet in Chambersburg, they didn't know what was going on. But Lee kept this up for 2 solid hours. The smoke apparently was tremendous, as you can imagine. And at 3 p.m., they're running a little low on their long-range ammunition. And Lee's artillerymen saw through the smoke, and he was correct that 18 guns were being pulled back from the Federal side, and right at the center of the line. And he mistook these 18 guns being pulled back, that they were starting to retreat, that his cannonade had been effective. Little did he know that most of the Federal troops, instead of being on the other side of the ridge, were pretty much on top of the ridge along those stone walls. Maybe we can see some of those stone walls later on. And they were just crouched down behind the stone walls, just trying to withstand this barrage. Many of the shells failed to explode, and some of them didn't exploded erratically. So that there wasn't the accuracy in the cannonade that most people think. But anyway, 18 guns were pulled back. I read once where one article said that they pulled back to get new ones, fresh ones in, and I went to get new caissons because the other caissons are being shattered. A lot of the batteries were shattered. It was quite accurate fire on both sides. This was supposed to have been the greatest cannonade in the Western Hemisphere before or since at that time for any battle. It certainly was Lee's finger, and there is Lee on his horse there, and the word has gotten out that the Federals are pulling back. The cannonade stops at 3 p.m. And some 14,000 troops are massed in the woods behind Lee's cannon. And there's Meade on the opposite side. He said he actually was on his horse. That's not a shell going by, that's a trail from a jet plane. This happened to be like a zipping by his head. Anyway, I should have mentioned that these cannons stretched out for 2 miles along that ridge. And the Confederates are told, head for the trees, in so many words, courage and so forth. Longstreet failed to give any stirring words to this because he realized that there was going to be a carnage, which it was. But Longstreet did not have any ultimate plans to defeat the Union. But that little clump of trees, which was bigger at that time, what they say, but could be seen just about a mile away, and 14,000, depending on what figures you read, 11,500, 14,500 troops started off in waves across towards the middle of that line, thinking that the cannonade had done its job. I often think that the way these statues pictured, they have a certain look about them, and you wonder whether they really, this is from the Lee statue, whether they really think they're going to make it or not. And all these statues have a certain look about them. Unfortunate the tragedy which of course did occur to those forces. There's the backside from North Carolina's reverse, but that's still North Carolina. Actually. So the cavalry starts with Pickett at its head. Longstreet's corps, some of Longstreet's corps is in there, and 11,500, 14,500, some whatever it is, start off for the ridge. And they even say that there was kind of a lull in the battle. There was no sense of firing a musket at that point. I don't know who that general is, but the typical soldier and Arab is to be watching with Roosevelt in the line then. Many of the soldiers wrote about it. And these statues that they have lined up facing the Cemetery Ridge really portray probably what occurred on that day as they watched what was happening across the way. This man with a sharp sword carving there. The troops of Pickett and called Pickett's Charge along Longstreet, the troops were in there too. Started out, some cavalry units, started out on a whole mile-long front across open field. There were fences there, and there's some fences now, but not like as I understand were there before. But that didn't hold it down. And of course, the Union was waiting for this. As you go down on the battlefield, and you see, begin to see well, there's a couple of buses down there, and I think there's a close-up shot of the high point at which they got. That's looking a little further south. That's the Pennsylvania, the biggest memorial there in Pennsylvania. And they were streaming across there in successive waves towards the federal line. Here's the typical stone fence that you see there, and Union forces behind. That's today, of course, waiting for them to get into range. Cannon, of course, were made ready. And Union cannon used canister shot, which are like great big marbles at the proper time. And this is on part of that cycle island. This is Meade's headquarters. You see, got a lot of damage done by that shell fire. But Meade had to abandon his headquarters because of the shell fire coming from the opposite way. And we have advance of the Confederates. They tried to pull some of the guns had to, or were pulled back. Some of the Federal guns, but on they came. Went on for 50 minutes, they say, less than an hour. Probably less than the time they took to give this talk here, that one charge. This is the famous picture. It's not a very good one to show on a screen like this, but certain generals can be identified, including the Confederate general. You can't see him, but you can see it on a big picture of it. And he has his hat on his sword, and he's reaching towards the battery there, and he's shot dead just as he gets up there, exhorting his men on. Only a cluster of 175 men got that far. And this is the angle, what they call a bloody angle, where you saw the buses from up above. This is about as far as they got, and the guns were pulled back from there. And you can see that little statue, or you see it looks very small now, across the way, over on Seminary Ridge. This is as far as they got. This is looking from the Confederate side. This is as far as they got. And they began to stream back. And of course, this is the result of the carnage. It was unbelievable. 6,500 were left. 6,500 casualties out of that. That one charge. So Gettysburg is called certainly the bloodiest battle recorded history up to that time. And I think, depending on how you define a battle, may still be labeled because there's almost continuous fighting going on. Certainly couldn't fight at night very much. Almost continuous fighting. So we find not a defeated exactly, like a crushed Army of Virginia back to their line of cannon. They're bringing the wounded they can. There's been very gripping stories written about this by the observers that were with Lee. Lee that night called in one of his cavalry generals who hadn't seen much action and turned over the security of bringing those wounded back back to Virginia. He said more than that, and I'll avoid have it in my suitcase. But he said a lot more than that. But, he knew that the battle was over, and that he had to get back to Virginia. We're back in the rain on a Saturday and a Sunday. Even some of Longstreet's corps was still in Gettysburg on Sunday, believe it or not. And Meade stayed regrouping himself back up on the Cemetery Ridge. This was Meade's retreat here. The wagon train went through back to Gettysburg and down this way. The wagon train went here, and should point out earlier, Potomac River, all through the Potomac River office, West Sea. Had to get across the Potomac River and get back into Martinsburg, back down to Winchester, which is headed to. And it actually, this Courier service is very good. It turned out ammunition from Winchester all the while. Head down to Hagerstown, turned back with the troops and the mobile, the way the wagon train for some reason. We decided to pursue a couple of days. And we tried to fit getting across the Potomac River. Once again, however, the Union failed to do this, and failed to act with any kind of concern. They still had, even Lincoln wrote them after they had 50,000 troops still available. Some corps had made a forced march and come up, Sykes Corps, come up, I believe it was Sykes, or Sedgwick, and come up with a completely fresh corps. But these were a wagon train with 12,500 wounded, extended for 17 miles. Imagine how long that be, like almost from Armenia over to right into Poughkeepsie, I guess. 17-mile stretch of wagon trains, a wagon train. Lee retreated with all his cannon, believe it or not, and a few extra that they hadn't captured earlier. He headed back, but he didn't have much ammunition left. But he'd sent on word to Winchester, and they were sending up ammunition from Winchester. Logistics, how they supplied each other, it's very hard to believe. There's no radios and automobiles and anything except couriers. All in the rain for 2 days. I happened to pick this up at a flea market, and to my mind, it's the most telling story of what must have sunk in. Believe it or not, these men were still loyal to Lee. Whenever he'd ride by, they'd cheer him. He took all the blame on himself, and actually, they say he met Pickett when Pickett retreated back across the field and said to Pickett to prepare his men for a countercharge, and Pickett told him he had no men, and then Lee said it was all his fault. He took it all on his shoulders there, and there's some stories there, that human interest story you can read about the reaction of Lee and Meade there as they talked about what was going on in the last day or two. He finally got across the Potomac River. It even was in a flood stage, but he finally got himself back across the Potomac River. And believe it or not, they had a fighting force of some 50,000 men from several weeks later on back in the Shenandoah Valley. Meade lost his opportunity to capture Lee or force his surrender, and the war went on for 2 years after that. The ominous portent, of course, for the Confederacy was the fall of Vicksburg by Grant, who had besieged Vicksburg on the Mississippi, one of the last two strongholds on the Mississippi, on July 4th. But believe it or not, Lee was able to hold out right in his own backyard for 2 more years. There's a tower there. It's 9 o'clock. I think just a few more minutes. All right? Just to kind of sum up, there's a tower there, that I didn't take a picture of because it mars the landscape. Try to take pictures of just the scenes themselves. But I don't know if it's worth going up on there. It cost $2. And, I took some pictures, and then in the clouds, and then all of a sudden the sun broke down. And I took some more. So I have two sets of pictures here. But you can walk all around and see the whole hillside, and of course there are exhibits that point out where all the action took place over the 3 days. And you can look down on the heights. You can see that as a familiar scene. Looking down on the Seminary Ridge, that little row of trees, off towards Chambersburg. There's these Virginia Memorial across the way. The cyclorama building is down there in front of that round building, where those colorful pictures taken, action pictures, are painted. This is looking down that small ridge, even further down there. There's that angle again where that tree was, and the trumpet tree is not the one up where the turnpike, but the other trumpet tree is down in the corner there on the left. Is the high water mark, as they say. We follow that road around down by the Pennsylvania Memorial. Pennsylvania had 45,000 troops in there. All the names are listed in that memorial. And New York and Pennsylvania lost most of the casualties. 5% of the casualties of the Civil War sustained by the Union were at Gettysburg. It's hard to believe. There you look down, you see big round top there, and little round top in the foreground. You can't make it out much as a mountain or a hill, but there it is. This road takes you right along there, and well marked. Now we're looking for a portion on the other side there, which we didn't talk too much about, Culp's Hill there, which is almost worth it. The story to the south, what was going on there. I think it was that a New York battery had guns with optical sights on it that they got from France, believe it or not, and made them very accurate, and they were able to get very accurate shots down from the top of that hill into approaching troops on the other side of the hill. See, this is on the other side of the whole battlefield. Another shot of the hill. And we're looking down on the Baltimore Turnpike, and where the cemetery is, where it was, of course, at the time of the battlefield. Those are the other side of the battlefield, where a lot of the first day fighting took place. And also there was some fighting going on the other days, but not like what went on the third day out on the other side. I thought if I had time, I'd just show a slide or two here. Lee's plan failed on another score. Stuart had finally joined him, and he sent him all the way around the battlefield, and it's what they call the East Cavalry Battlefield. It's way around the other side of the mountain. It's 2.5 miles away. This last trip I was down there, went out to visit it, and there wasn't a soul around. But it's an open field, not a field of markers and cannon and so forth. But Lee had intended that Stuart come in from the opposite side of that ridge, a couple of miles away. But the plans were divined, and the Gregg's Cavalry, and you see that name around, Gregg's Cavalry, rode out to challenge them. And they were very evenly placed, but the Union had brought artillery with them. At a time which made the difference between sabers and artillery, because at this point these two units were fighting with sabers and pistols and so forth. Whereas, just as this scene tells you on the East battlefield. After that, they became equipped with carbines, like the type I showed you, but not all of them had carbines. But this was probably the last pitched battle with sabers, which the Confederates loved this type of battle. Stuart did. And so did somebody else here. I don't think you can read the name, but it's Custer. George Armstrong Custer, a big broad line, rode into the fray of battle just the complete counterpart of Stuart. Stuart had to retire from the field when the cannon was brought in, and the East Cavalry battle that really didn't amount to anything for either side. Certainly it foiled Lee's plans of bringing in another group from the opposite side. Of course, they weren't making out too well. Anyway, and then when Stuart got the word that the charge had failed by Pickett, he retired. These are just some shots around that you can see. This meets the house restored. Yeah. There's I tried to catch oh, how did I get in there? All of a sudden you see strange little sites like this, or a house, very attractive house in there. You just stop and take a picture. Well, I think that is all until unless we get back to day one again.